My distinguished invitees, on behalf of Professor T.S. Achyuta History Endowment and Manipal Universal Press, I extend a warm welcome to attendees in the auditorium as well as online. I am D.A. Prasanna, convener of the Achyuta History Endowment. Professor Achyuta taught history at Mysore University from 1939 to 1965. The endowment perpetuates the academic and research values Professor Achyuta stood for. Endowment's initiative so far has resulted in international conferences, endowment lectures, publication of 7 history books, book discussions, performance history events, and a DSA history channel on YouTube, hosting nearly 100 history videos. DSA History Endowment Advisory Board was chaired by Dr. S. Setter, whose portrait is on the desk. He was Professor Achyuta's illustrious student, and as you know, he was chairman of the Indian Council for Historical Research. He has guided the endowment activities, and he has helped us to get the outcomes I mentioned so far. Today's book is the result of an international conference conceptualized by Dr. Setter. It was organized by Professor Parul Pandyadhar. She has edited the book, and we are privileged to be associated with Professor Dhar, the eminent scholar. We worked with the academic publisher Manipal Universal Press. Outcome is International Quality Publications under the DSA History Series. These books and other titles are available in the foyer for browsing and purchase. Professor Achyuta and Professor Setter's photos adorn the stage today. We draw inspiration from them. To continue serving the history community, we seek history proposals from scholars, writers, artists, and institutions for consideration and support. Thank you. The next segment is about Manipal Universal Press. I invite on the stage Professor Neeta Inamdar, Chief Editor of Manipal Universal Press, a reputed university publishing house. She is the Jean Monnet Chair at Manipal Center for European Studies at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, a national institution of eminence. Professor Inamdar.
Good evening once again to all those who have gathered here, making this event possible despite all the challenges. And all of us have been craving for some kind of a human connect, some kind of interaction, and some kind of learning from each other. Something that we have taken for granted so long, but here we are finally together, wearing masks, taking off masks and introducing each other as if we are meeting for the first time. We had this outside while having tea. But still, we are together. Very happy to see quite some audience who have dared to come out. And of course, there are quite a few online. I know some of our authors who finally decided they were in this difficulty, they were having this conflict whether to come or come online, and I'm sure they're online. So thank you very much for joining us online. So today's book, The Multivalence of an Epic, retelling the Ramayana in South Indian Southeast Asia. So we're really, really proud of this particular book, which is an outcome of the relentless efforts of the on behalf of all of us. Worked very meticulous, and she sat on the heads of my team members. And but it was worth it all when we have a look at the book now. Really happy with that. And of course, very, very major and those who have worked with him know how he works. So he's smiling today. So So working with all of them was a very interesting and a learning experience for all of us at Manipal University Press. I still call it Manipal University Press because this is how it was established in 2011. But over a period of time, we made it Manipal Universal Press for some reasons. Well, of course, also when we expanded to many publications and beyond what we initially planned. So today's is a 213th publication of NUP, and we are very happy we are in the decennial year. So it feels like just yesterday that we started of publishing with the first book, which was on Pramana Paddhati. This was our first book. It was called The Path of Proofs, an epistemological work in psychophilosophy, and it was very well received, and we started a journey with that. And has signed up to cooperation with Spring the Nature, and it is for some select books. And we have started working on the first book that's on ancient India identities, boundaries, and cultural practices. This probably will be the first NUP Springer publication that will go, then which would mean it would go global in its reach. Indian market will be taken care of by NUP. I know for scholars it's important that your books are accessible to Indian audiences at an affordable price, which I think MEP can take care. And the global reach probably made possible through Springer, which is very expensive in terms of the books that you see around. And that's the reason probably this comes across as a possible solution to some of the challenges we have when it comes to academic books. And yeah, that's all I have in the presentation, but really happy that many of you have turned up. We are looking forward. These are the first 10 years that I presented, but we are now in the stage of planning for the next 10 years. And we really, this last 10 years have been an exciting journey, and we wish the next 10 years are going to be as exciting as those or even more. And in that journey, we wish you join our hands, and then we all take together the kind of books that we all envision maybe for the future, and how to make them affordable, how to ensure they reach the right kind of audience, the right kind of readership. We are looking for more ideas, and if you have any, please feel free to reach out to us, and please know that we are listening very much there. So thank you. And before I close, I would like to welcome Professor Ghosh. She's going to be on the panel very soon. A very special welcome to her and all the authors. We have Shri Mukunda, whose book we have published. We have Shri Raghunath. We have quite a few in the audience who have worked with us already, and there are quite a few online, I know. I welcome each one of them, and have a great evening ahead. Thank you very much.
The next segment is about today's book under release. I invite to the stage Professor Parul Pandya Dhar, editor of Multivalence of an Epic Retelling Ramayana in South India and Southeast Asia. It has been a privilege for DSA History Endowment to work with this eminent art historian. She is professor in history at the University of Delhi. She has authored and edited several books on art history, architectural history, connected history, and cultural history. She is engaged in art and mobility, visuality and memory, and epic encounters across the ocean. Professor Dhar.
Good evening. It is with a sense of fulfillment and gratitude that I present to you a brief overview of the book, The Multivalence of an Epic, Retelling the Ramayana in South India and Southeast Asia. It is a project that I have held dear, and one that has engaged my intellectual energies in multiple roles. As conference co-convener with Professor Setter, as author contributor, as editor, since the September of 2017, exactly 4 years this month. The book is foremost the result of a rewarding collaboration between 19 distinguished scholars who have interpreted the many values and meanings that inhere in the continuous making and remaking, viewing, experiencing, and reviewing the Ramayana tradition. This narrative moves from classical to folk forms or vice versa, from temples and palaces to theaters and bylanes, and from ancient to modern times, ever so often crossing boundaries that are not enslaved to sectarian, communal, regional, or national divides. The book explores the epic's journey in three parts: visual, literary, and performance cultures. South Indian and Southeast Asian Ramayana traditions are placed in deliberate juxtaposition in this book. Historians investigating the cultural, political, and socio-economic processes that have linked pre-modern India and Southeast Asia have proposed the theory of cultural convergence, which proposes and observes analogous developments between the two regions across the Eastern Indian Ocean. Investigating epic encounters through the prism of cultural convergence is a rewarding direction of inquiry, and readers will find in the organization of this book a potential resource to explore epic connections in the light of cultural convergence. The first part on visual cultures, sculptures, paintings, and inscriptions is located first because these are often, in the case of South India and Southeast Asia, the earliest available expressions of the Ramayana. This part includes essays by Parul Pandya Dhar, John Brockington, Valerie Gillette, Rachel Loizu, Sharada Srinivasan, who is present here today, Gauri Krishnan, Keshavan Rajarajan, and Cheryl Tiruchelvam. A lot of our dear contributors are present online also today. Now, this group of 8 authors unfold a rich tapestry of sculptures, paintings, and inscriptions, where the earliest carved narratives from the Deccan and the Deep South share space with images such as a 7th century Rama sculpture from Phnom Da in faraway Cambodia. Such deliberate juxtapositions throw open a range of observations and questions, of which some, though not all, find their answers within the pages of this book. Inscriptions about Ram and Ravan reveal the importance of the epic in the political imagination on both sides of the Bay of Bengal. Visual imagery, frozen in stone, holds clues to lost texts and performance practices of yester centuries. Gaps in sources of one type are filled in by traces from the past in other sources. Sculptures from the Hoysal period in Karnataka meet Nayaka period paintings from Mallirunchollai in Tamil Nadu that bear inspiration from the Alvar hymns and Kamban's Iramavataram. Chol and Vijayanagar metal icons of Ramayana characters reveal their aesthetic and processional value in temple rituals. Second millennium Angkorian Ramayana relief sculptures from Cambodia reveal a preference for the battle scenes from the Yuddha Kanda, even as new motifs with localizing tendencies are in evidence. Colorful character transformations, such as that of Hanuman in Southeast Asia, offer a counterpoint to his presumed monolithic conceptions in popular Indic imagination. Contemporary negotiations of the epic in the visual arts of Malaysia are discussed in a study linking these to the wayang kulit or shadow puppet tradition and the hikayats of the epic in Islamic affiliation. Wayang kulit in contemporary Malaysia has now evolved from its traditional leather puppet forms to the canvas. It has been digitized and combined with modern stories and characters into what is now called fusion wayang kulit. The second part on literary cultures engages with texts, their content, narrative accent, recitation, and associated imagery. Scholars to this part include Malini Saran, Chirapat Prapandavidya, Mary Brockington, A.J. Thomas, Sudha Gopalakrishnan, and Thomas Hunter. The section opens with a discussion on governance and ethics in 9th century Old Javanese Ramayana, which is the oldest available Southeast Asian text on the subject and is known to have followed the 7th century Indian text, the Ravana Vadha, composed by Bhatti. It was written for recitation and for the art of Vayankulit, thus fusing boundaries between the textual and the performative and revealing innovative processes of localization. By contrast, with the destruction of Ayutthaya by the Burmese army in 1767, no Ramayana text from an earlier period has survived in Thailand. While the Thailand Ramakiyan is likely to have been composed from a Ramayana story retold by a narrator from South India, as one of our contributors has written, the carvings of the Khmer temples in Thailand suggest the presence of the Valmiki Ramayana there as well. So both these were moving alongside. The introduction of new characters, such as the enigmatic female Benyakai in Thai versions, and Hanuman's liaison with her are also explored in this book. A complex web of sharing and innovation of narrative elements and motifs among intra-Southeast Asian and between Indian and Southeast Asian Ramayana texts emerges from the essays in this section. Now, translation is itself an act of retelling, and this marks two contributions here. Erutachan's Adhyatma Ramayanam Kiripatu, a Malayalam Bhakti text, and another Malayalam poetic text, Chinta Vishtayaya Sita by Kumaran Ashan, which has been translated in English here and offers a contemporary interpretation of Sita's introspection about her life. Moving from translation now to recitation as an act of retelling, a close study of the Mabasan Ramayana recitation in Bali is an important value addition to this volume. Text, recitation, translation, and performance are at work in inextricable juxtaposition in this section. Coming to the final section, performance cultures. It includes theatre, puppetry, and folk practices, with contributions here by Paula Richmond, Ghulam Sarwar Yusuf, Krishnamurti Hanuru, Purushottam Bilimale, and Sirangleng. Performance ushers the contemporary in deep engagement with the epic's past, as observed in representations of the Ramayana in modern theatre. Ravanodbhavam, or the origins of Ravana, performed in Kathakali, and Ilankeshwaran, king of Lanka, a mid-20th century Tamil mythological drama. The epic antagonist appears in these productions in a more sympathetic light in times of social and political anxieties, when the rule of Ravan may have offered alternative possibilities. Far away, in the Malay Peninsula, Vayang Kulit Kelantan is again based on a local oral version known as Hikayat Maharajavana, or the story of Ravana, thus Ravanayana and not Ramayana. Echoes of popular Islam in Malay versions of the epic are also seen, for example, in the encounter between Adam, who is sent by Allah, and who meets Ravana and forgives him in Lanka. Ramayanas from bylanes are seen in folk versions of the epic. Striking negotiations between vernacular and Sanskrit traditions and subsequent transformations in characterization to suit the ideals of the folk world reveal local processes of idealization and demonization of the characters in the folk traditions. Prompt improvisations by composers, musicians, actors, and spectators who are integral to the staging of a Yakshagana epic performance is another important contribution. Similarly, the performance of the Khmer Riamker bears a deep imprint of present-day Cambodian society. Now, what comes out of this volume to me as an editor, really, it is in the structure of the Mahakavya itself, in its early development from a core plot, which had its origins in oral traditions, and in its accretions over time, that its subplots lend themselves to independent expression, even when they cohere as meaningful parts of the whole. This internal structure of the epic enables selective adaptations of its parts, even as it generates more complete tellings in different contexts. At times, the epic is translated in its entirety, and even its basic narrative structure, progression, and the interrelationships between its elements are retained in the newer settings. At other times, counter narratives are created, altering relationships among its characters, modifying character traits, or shifting the balance between the protagonist, antagonist, and also the marginal characters. Categories of intrinsic and extrinsic, change and continuity, and parts and whole then offer useful perspectives to unravel the epic's multivalence. As it flows and adapts, its unique identity as Ramayana sustains even as it merges in a stream of continuous change. This assimilative power, its pluralism, is also its soul and strength. Categories of Margi Deshi, Shastriya Laukika, or Natya Dharmi Lokadharmi, which belong to performance practice and theory, also offer useful perspectives for interpreting the many layers of meanings that inhere in the epic. The selective transference and creative translation of narrative motifs and elements, the changes in character portrayals, and the omissions, additions, and elaborations transpire not only across regions and over time, but are also mutually influential among Margi and Deshi modes of expression within a given location-time nexus. This vertical integration is most palpable in the performance cultures. Performance as spontaneous creation born of artistic intuition and creativity, and its reception by the Rasika is of essence. Epic performance traditions bear the ancient in its innate flow as inherited wisdom and recreate its contemporary presences. The long solitary hours spent in the making of this book have gifted me many, many precious intangible rewards. Not all are possible to share here, but those interested will find their traces scattered all around the book and also in my introduction to the book. There are many more Ramayanas, new tellings continue to be created, and the ways of perceiving are many as well. To privilege any monolithic or exclusive reading, then, is antithetical to its very essence. I would like to thank especially late Professor Shadakshari Setter, the D.S. Achyuta Rao History Foundation, and the entire team at Manipal Universal Press for their faith in me. Thank you very much. My gratitude especially and very genuinely to Surabhi Gurukar for a stunning, stunning jacket design. Thank you, Surabhi. Finally, thank you all for your indulgence in listening to me. Namaskar.
The next segment is book release. It is my privilege to introduce Ambassador Nirupa Menon Rao. She has distinguished herself in the Indian Foreign Service, holding many ambassador positions. She retired as the Foreign Secretary. Post her retirement, she served as India's ambassador to the USA during 2011-13. Subsequently, she has been visiting professor at leading global universities. She has an active interest in music, art, culture. Her book, The Fractured Himalayas, India, Tibet and China, 1949 to 1962, is shortly being released by Penguin Random House. She regrets that she can't be present physically here this evening as she's traveling. She has recorded her release address. Can we have the address, please?
Shri D.A. Prasanna, Professor Neeta Inamdar, Professor Parul Pandyadhar, who is the editor of the book we are discussing today, Professor Suchandra Ghosh, Ms. Madhu Nataraj of the Natya STEM Dance Company. Dear friends, it gives me great pleasure to be here today at the release of an important work of impressive scholarship, one that explores the many journeys of the Ramayana across the southern reaches of our subcontinent and in the transoceanic space beyond the Bay of Bengal, in Myanmar, Malaysia, Thailand, and beyond. This book, The Multivalence of an Epic, retelling the Ramayana in South India and Southeast Asia, is a record and an interpretation of history encapsulated through inscriptions, trading contacts, cultural diplomacy, and political give and take. It divulges fascinating insights that are in many ways a retelling of our most sacred beliefs, beliefs held in the innermost sanctum of the soul. The realization that this consciousness is shared across the seas, albeit in different forms of interpretation, brings home to one that a temporal world's dialogue with the spiritual transcends linear boundaries and enshrines a common humanity. This is a study, therefore, that demonstrates not only the power of an Indian cultural idiom, but also the appeal and the lure of our civilizational ethos, how our ancient forebears acted east, foreshadowing the policies formulated by our mandarins today. In the multivalence of the Ramayana and its many manifestations, we see soft power attaining the pinnacle of its reach and influence and becoming the vector for a political and strategic reach that was truly epic. It is this volume's engagement, as it says, and I quote, with the inherent plurality, diversity, and adaptability of the epic, unquote, the Ramayana, quote, in changing contexts and with shifting norms, tastes, traditions, and ideologies, unquote, in idioms that are classical and folk, temples and palaces, to theatres and bylanes in cities and villages, that make this study so special and striking. In these ways, the various retellings of the Ramayana become animated renderings, voiceovers that are not lost in translation, that demolish racial, linguistic, and class divides, emphasizing a richness and a profundity of devotion that will not be stifled or stilled. The mind is transfixed by these diverse images of all the central characters of the epic, revealing, as the book states, diverse priorities, motivations, proclivities, and selective adaptations, moving across a many-splendored spectrum that speaks of a protean Ramayana, how the ways of perceiving the epic are many. Yet, through this divergence, the implicit underlying core is one of cultural convergence, a pan-Asian multivalence, as if each dancer, each sculpture, each representation, regardless of the location, are all branches of a living, speaking tree tied to similar myths of origin, many voices united in harmonious polyphony. The Ramayana and the reverence and fascination in which the epic is held needs hardly to be explained to all of you. Those of you who are old enough will recall the televising of the epic by Doordarshan TV in the 1980s and the worshipful adulation the serializing of the epic received. I recall visiting the remote tribal village of Taksing in Arunachal Pradesh on the Indo-Tibetan border in 1989 on a morning when the latest episode of the Ramayana was being aired. The village was deserted when our helicopter landed. We were told that every single resident who was otherwise isolated from the world beyond was gathered before the sole television set in the village watching the Ramayana. It is this essence of connectivity, uniting people across ethnicities and lived experience, that is also expressed so magically in many communities of the Indian diaspora, and here I speak particularly of the Caribbean. The Ramayana, as the name of the epic suggests, is about journeys, odysseys, and similar epics involving the stretches to which the endurance and the solidity of character of their heroes are tested come to mind. There is yet another set of journeys that is also recalled, those of indentured labor from India crossing the high seas to various destinations across the Indian Ocean and stretching into the Caribbean. I think of the way memory was enshrined in the minds of those who undertook these journeys, memory that outlasts the passage of generations. This is what drew me to Derek Walcott's Nobel lecture, which is one of the most evocative renderings of the purpose of memory and how its survival is so vital to ensure the living nature of sacred traditions that go beyond concepts of imaginary homelands. The performance of the Ram Leela that Walcott witnessed and writes about was a rendition of one of the greatest epics in the world performed, and I quote, not with that desperate resignation of preserving a culture, but with an openness of belief that was as steady as the wind bending the cane lances of the Caroni plain, unquote. The players and the young actors who Walcott saw personified elation, a delight of conviction, not of a loss of identity or a homeland. I quote, they believed in what they were playing, in the sacredness of the text, the validity of India, unquote. I was taken with Walcott's likening of this love and longing personified in the performance to a broken vase that is reassembled and where the attachment to that broken, restored vase is stronger than that love which took its symmetry for granted when it was whole, unquote. This assembling of broken pieces that, I quote again, contain more pain than their original sculpture, those icons and sacred vessels taken for granted in their ancestral places, unquote, broken off from the original continent, is what makes the experience so unique. When one witnesses the performances of the Ramayana in Southeast Asia, too, I recall how Walcott put it in the context of the Caribbean, that even though the original language dissolves from the exhaustion of distance, like fog trying to cross an ocean, these are his words, the process of finding new metaphors becomes the assembling by a poet of nouns from necessity. Through the depiction of the Ramayana, Walcott's Caribbean Indian performers hear once again that inner Asia of the soul, a rekindling of that collective memory of an entire race whose genealogies may or may not originate from the subcontinent, just as in one of the young performers dressed as a warrior who flies his bamboo arrow over the cane fields of that Caribbean village with unbounded delight. I could sense that same magic while witnessing a performance of the Ramayana at Borobudur in Indonesia a few years ago. The Ramayana is thus a mirror of the Indian soul, but also of a universal soul. And as this new book explains, further tellings of the epic will continue to be created, together with new ways of perceiving it. It can never be monolithic or exclusive in its interpretation. The very definition of epic, the word epic, to me, suggests the limitless scope of human endeavor, of the distant polarities to which the body and spirit can aspire, in reaching the pinnacles of endurance and exploration in order to seek the meaning of existence. The Ramayana and its many retellings expresses that, its appeal resting in the crossing of barriers of nationality and faith, class and creed, charting new pathways into the unknown and the unexplored. It thus belongs to the family of every man and woman, a celestial song divine. Thank you once again. And ladies and gentlemen, I congratulate the Professor D.S. Achyutarao Endowment for making this wonderful book possible and bringing it to a wide audience. It gives me great pleasure now to release the multivalence of an epic retelling the Ramayana in South India and Southeast Asia, edited by Parul Pandyadhar. Ladies and gentlemen, the book.
She's outstanding, is it not? So, I'm happy to share that in addition to the virtual release, we will have a physical book release now because we can't do without it. I invite on stage the scholar Dr. Sharada Srinivasan, Professor in Humanities and a Padma Shri awardee, noted choreographer and dancer Madhu Nataraj, DSA Endowment Advisory Board members Professor Rajani Prasanna, art historian, and Surabhi Gurukar, accomplished graphic designer. I invite the members of the discussion panel, Professor Dhar, Professor Shiva Prakash, Professor Suchandra Ghosh, and moderator Dr. Inamdar. So, Revati, kindly give a book to each one of them. So I request the photograph to be taken. So let us open the book. So may I request Professor Inamdar, Professor Ghosh, Professor Dhar, and Professor Shiva Prakash to remain on stage for the book discussion. Rest of us will leave the stage and I hand over the stage to Professor Inamdar.
So welcome once again to the central idea of today's event. That's a discussion on the book. And there are two people here who are very nervous, the editor and the publisher, because it's like a feedback session, because there are two major scholars to whom the book was spent quite some time ago, and they have read the entire thing. And now they're going to speak about the book. And so very quickly to introduce Professor Suchandra Ghosh. She's presently the professor at the Department of History, University of Hyderabad. She was formerly professor at the Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Kolkata. Her present areas of research are politico-cultural history of Northwest India, early Indian linkages with early Southeast Asia, Indian Ocean Buddhist and Trade Networks, and History of Everyday Life. She's a recipient of Charles Wallace Visiting Fellowship, Nehru Trust UK Travel Award, Anita Scholarship, and a lot more, many more of the scholarships. She was awarded the Savitri Chandra Shobha Memorial Prize of Indian History Congress for the book From the Oxus to the Indus, a political and cultural study in 2017. She acted as a sectional president, Ancient India section for the 80th session of Indian History Congress and Regional History Congress in West Bengal and Punjab. And she also has many other accolades, but I stop here and then I specially welcome her for this panel. Very special welcome to you, Suchandra. And Professor H.S. Shivprakash, who needs no introduction, definitely not in Bangalore at all, even otherwise throughout India. So poet, playwright, and translator, is one among the prominent literary figures in the country, recognized as a fresh voice in Kannada literature at a very young age. He eventually became an eminent bilingual poet and translator across multiple languages. As a renowned scholarly authority in Kannada, on Kannada Vachana literature, Sufism, Indian Bhakti traditions, and mystic symbolism, his literary prowess lies in reinventing the aesthetic elements in Indian mysticism. So he has received several accolades, including Sahitya Academy Award. For long, he worked as a professor at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at GNU. He was also the director of Tagore Center at Berlin, run by ICCR. And he has 7 anthologies of poems, 12 plays, and several other books to his credit. And of course, we are very happy one of his books got published with NUP as well. We have limited 40 minutes for the discussion on the book, and so we straight head to this. And I invite Professor Shivprakash to share his first impressions of the book and on the multivalence of the epic itself. So if you can, I have heard you for minimum 40 minutes before, but today we have 10 minutes to begin with, and we come back for the second round.
10 minutes is, in fact, too little time to speak about this voluminous work. And I'm very happy to be here because I was involved in the conception of the seminar. Professor Shettar discussed this with me on phone when I was in Delhi. And it's unfortunately is not with us. So I remember him, and I miss all of us missing. Because this whole thing was a brainchild of Shettar's scholarly imagination. A lot of people have great scholarship, but they don't have scholarly imagination. So when Professor Shettar writes history, we never know whether he's writing history or poetry. It's acceptable to historians. It also touches the hearts of non-scholarly poets. And first of all, I think I should spend at least 5 minutes to congratulate everybody involved. The editor, Parul Pandya, and Professor Shettar, I know, had great trust in our scholarship. She was as close to Professor Shettar as I am, and she's done a wonderful job. And it's a scholarly tour de force, as they put it. And they should also congratulate Professor Chitra Trust. Without their initiative, this seminar, it was a historic seminar, and this book, this monumental book, which has been there. So, Professor Margin, kudos to you. And then the publishers. I hope that they'll publish all my future books. They're so beautifully produced. It's a delight to hold in the hand. It's very heavy, but it's beautifully produced. And the cover page, the photographs, everything is so beautifully done. So it's meticulously edited and beautifully produced. And most of the the papers presented in this book, are, though they are, written with great academic vigor, they're also read very well. Even a lay reader like me can read this book without having to take Sariga. There have been other books on the multiplicities and multivalences of the Ramayana. In the past, we have A.K. Ramanujan's, the historic book in the Ramayana, Paula Richmond's book, 300 Ramayanas, and my friend Molly Kaushal edited a volume of, papers presented with a historic seminar which was organized by the Indira Gandhi National Center for Arts, where the greatest international scholars participated. But what is special about this book is specific emphasis on the kinship between South Asia and Southeast Asia. There have been efforts in the past to connect the cultures of the northeastern part of India to Southeast Asia. For example, IGNCA organized a big seminar and festival of Northeast and Northeast India and Southeast Asia connection. But this book specifically emphasizes the connection between South India and Southeast Asia. And this is something very special about this book. And this kind of emphasis, to the best of my knowledge, I have not found in the literature of this kind in the past. What is this Ramayana? Ambassador Rao, when she spoke, she talked about this, sanctity, sacred work. It's there, it's part of it. It's not entirely true. Because what is sacred to a Hindu in India is not sacred in the same sense to a Buddhist in Thailand or somebody in Cambodia. When the agency organized some 10 years ago, I think, a festival of Southeast Asian Ramayanas, we interviewed most of the artists. But I asked the Burmese Ramayana actor who played Sita, what do you find interesting in this? She said, we love the story. And how do you look upon Rama? We respect Rama as a great follower of Buddha's teachings. For them, Rama is a Buddhist, an ideal Buddhist. And not all of these versions of the Ramayana are imbued with religious fervor. Lots of playful Ramayanas. Rama's story began, I don't know how long ago, the 3rd century, is that right? If Rama has any history. It's not ended. Till today, Ramayanas are being rewritten. Yesterday, Prasannaji asked me to give a caption for this program. I could think of one line, I think in the composition of Purandara. Alli nodelu Rama, Illi nodelu Rama, Yellili nodelu Rama. Look here, Rama is there. Look there, Rama is there. Look wherever you find Rama. Rama in sculpture, Rama in poetry, Rama in theatre. There's a bewildering number of Rama theatres, even puppetry and shadow play, and so many Ramlilas. It's not just Ramlila of Ramnagar. Ramnagar is famous for two things: Ramlila and Lassi. Ramnagar Lassi is world famous. Okay, and there are so many Ramlilas in Madhya Pradesh, Uttarakhand, in the Madhubani Ramlila, which is a kind of indoor performance, and so many of them. This bewildering, mind-boggling. And in the Himalayas, there are so many Ramayanas, and they can begin anywhere and end anywhere. and hundreds of folk poems. For example, one of the contributors, my former colleague Rajarajan says, that there is, one can reconstruct a Ramayana from the composition of Tamil Alva saints, and they try to reconstruct that on the basis of Perumal Tirumoli by Kulasekara Alva, who was a great Sanskrit and Tamil poet, who was also a playwright. And many people say that Bhakti tradition was anti-Sanskrit. No, it was not, because Kulasekara Alva was a remarkable poet, both in Tamil and in Sanskrit. His Mukundamala, one of the greatest devotional works ever written in Indian literature. So, for example, we can reconstruct the Ramayana based on the composition of our saint poets. But here, it's impossible for any book to do justice to the mind-boggling variety of Ramayanas. What's interesting about this book? Of course, Parulji has already summarized different chapters of the book to you so beautifully and so succinctly. What's interesting about this book is like it connects several dots, one here in sculpture, one here in the literature, one there in Myanmar, one there in Cambodia. It makes very interesting connections. I remember in one of the passages in Tantraloka, Abhimanyu says, a good scholar should be like a frog jumping from point to point and trying to make connections. He says it should also be a lion in the dense forests of books, scholarships. I don't know, none of us, but what this book is making, it fulfills the first condition that Abhinav Gupta was on scholarship, to make interesting connections like a frog. So this book does that. And it's the way the book is organized, orchestrated, is not something which an art historian could do. Art historian can be boring. I know a lot of them in JNU. I don't understand them, speaking. But Parulji is not only an artist, she's also an artist. She's a rare combination of artistic creativity and scholarly rigor. And this volume is an embodiment of this rare kind of.
Any particular section that you liked more than the other? There are 3 sections in the book. Anything that is?
No, all of them were learning experiences. And I've read it once, read many more times. It's not the kind of book one can read and put into a kind of pinhole. This kind of question. It's very interesting. And what's interesting is the variety of approaches in the book. It's not, the treatment is not monotonous. Just as Ramayanas are reconstructed from different perspectives, the pieces in this book are written from different perspectives. So it's a kind of a polyphonic music. It has that kind of structure.
Thank you so much. Suchandra, if in the first 10 minutes you could tell us about your impressions, the first impressions, and then we'll come back.
Good evening, everyone. I congratulate Professor D.S. Achyuta Rao for endowment and Manipal Academy for Higher Education for striving for academic excellence, and in that endeavor promoting knowledge and making us aware of our heritage through publication of such kind of books that we are discussing today. Thank you very much for inviting me. It is indeed a privilege, and I pay my homage to the memory of Professor S. Setter, whom I first met in 1999 in Leiden, and our association continued. Professor Shiva Prakash has just mentioned about A.K. Ramanujan. So we all know that we were introduced to the prospect of a variety of Rama tales told by others with radical differences among them by the seminal work of A.K. Ramanujan. And it is heartening to see this book actually brings that concept to the fore. The book, Multivalence of the Epic, retelling the Ramayana in South India and Southeast Asia, has been excellently introduced by the editor, Professor Parul Pandya Dhar, whose passion and hard work loom large in the editing and production of the book. Manipal University Press, I must say this, has gone beyond their own set standard of publication. In this case, I congratulate them, and they are much, much better than many leading international publishers. The photography, the colored pictures. Nowadays, publishers don't want to print in colors. The art historians know that very well. And so it's a sheer delight to see the book, to hold the book in hand and have the impressions that wonderfully came through the pictures. Professor Shiva Prakash has actually enlightened us by his oration now. And when I was reading the book, I found that each of the contributors, we all know, are specialists in the field, and they have all contributed to the making of this amazing book, which is a serious addition to knowledge, not only in the epic studies, but also in the domain of India and Southeast Asian studies. We heard Ambassador Nirupama Rao talking about Caribbean also, the scenario, and I found that it is wonderful. We have this one spectrum, Southeast Asia. In the other spectrum, we have Caribbean. So this has come out so well in her lecture too. Now, when we talk of Southeast Asia in the context of any region, two names actually resonate in our mind. One is Suvarna Bhumi, which is identified with mainland Southeast Asia. The other is Suvarnadipa, which is the maritime Southeast Asia. This book traverses both the land and the water. Here we have a series of interesting essays which speak about the retelling of the variety of the narration of the Rama Katha, engagement with a particular episode of the Rama story, which in a spatio-temporal context, and also in the context of the mediums. So many different mediums have been used for retelling the stories. Moreover, the book demonstrates the degree of Rama story's influence on various local cultures. Thus, multiple layers, multiple versions, multiple topoi of the Ramayana unfold in front of us through this book. This was possible only through interactions between regions of India and regions of Southeast Asia. In case of this book, the chosen area is South India. I must say that I always think that we should never use this blanket term India, Southeast Asia. It was the different regions which actually interacted with different regions of Southeast Asia in various time frame. So it's very good that it has come that South India and Southeast Asia. Now these interactions could be through multiple routes. And when we look at these interactions, we find that the beginning of the uninterrupted maritime exchanges and the land exchanges true in the East Coast, coastal and high sea voyages alike, goes for gaining a momentum since the 1st century CE. And it has been viewed by scholars, like when we look at this interaction, through the lens of Indianization or localization, and also through convergence, which is articulated by Professor Harman Kulke. Harman Kulke's thesis of looking at convergence on both sides of the Bay of Bengal seems to be more acceptable, as he emphasizes that it was not social distance, but social nearness that was the crucial factor in selecting and adopting certain Indian cultural elements in Southeast Asia. So thus, we see that nearness between the societies of the coastal regions of Bay of Bengal made the Indian model so attractive to societies there. And this assimilation, adaptation, borrowing, all, and using the indigenous elements came through in such a beautiful way that we have so many Ramayanas in different parts of Southeast Asia. And so therefore, this nearness was obviously made possible by all kinds of connectivity between the regions. I'm so glad that Parul has taken Kulke's thesis forward in the introduction of the book and talks about investigating epic encounters within South India and between the two zones through the prism of cultural convergence, which has received little attention so far. She talks about the way boundaries of medium and genre have been crossed in artistic expressions of the Ramayana tradition and how such crossings have shaped the creation of new Ramayanas. These crossings, also in the literal sense of the term, were indeed facilitated by the maritime and the coastal routes and the voyages of people, monks, merchants, traders, artisans. These are all agencies through which the stories were told, retold, and story ideas were actually moving around between the regions of South Asia and Southeast Asia. There were many traveling narratives like the stories from the Jatakas, Avadanas, and the epics, which touched the heart and the imagination of the people of Southeast Asia. There has been retelling of the narratives, and here the epic Ramayana stands out. Ramayana has been retold, rewritten, reenacted, and refashioned across South and Southeast Asian landscape. And significantly, I was not aware of it, I learned from the book that in inscription, in Southeast Asia, the story goes back to 6th century CE. So prior to the art historical evidence which Parul was mentioning in the introduction. So now, therefore, it was and it remains an integral part of the cultural consciousness and political imagination of the Asian people. In the regional Ramayana tellings, epigraphs assume a pride of place. We learn that in Karnataka, the earliest allusions to Rama and Ramayana comes from epigraphs, which played a role in the political imagination of the ruling dynasties. Again, in the context of the bronze sculptures, we learn that image of Rama, Sita, Lakshman, and Hanuman become important icons for processional worship, which was actually presented in our essay by Sharda Srinivasan, who is present here. Ramayana recitation gained popularity and became imbibed as an art form into the indigenous oral traditions, a unique form of story and performance manifested through visual forms. These dramatic performances involved tangible and intangible art forms, including oral traditions, folk songs, dances, pantomime, and artistic manifestations, which are embedded with symbolic connotations denoting self-experiences, collective memories, and ritualistic significance. There was a folk counterpart to Valmiki's version of the epic, which is an intangible heritage. So what we find is that often this kind of intangible heritage becomes tangible when a form is given to a narrative. So therefore, when we see the Ramayana narrative in the sculptures of Cambodia or so other places, so here is a moment where the intangible, the story, the folk stories gets transferred, gets translated into a tangible heritage. Often this intangible becomes tangible when I've already spoken that, so I may leave. But what is interesting also, when I was reading the articles, I found that just as the crafting of storytelling by the Buddhists in the Jatakas brought about a specific form of oral communication, the Ramakatha also became a favored means of articulating epic narratives. A few of the chosen episodes were given a form and a shape which added to the grandeur as the story came alive in visual representations. Thus, there was an interlacing of the intangible with the tangible. Why certain episodes were chosen over others is difficult to decide, but the authors tried to delve deeper into this for a possible reason. A case in point is the comparative prominence given to Hanuman in different kinds of time, periods of time, and also the preference of representing the Yuddha Kanda. So it is often said that a researcher is like a detective. And indeed, the narrative of the Floating Maiden by Mary Brockington read like a detective story. I was fascinated. The way the author traced the creative development of the Floating Maiden episode in the Thai Ramayana to Rajashekara's Bala Ramayana is remarkable. In South India, some of the popular indigenous theatrical traditions representing the Ramayana are Yakshagana of Karnataka and Kerala and Kathakali of Kerala. So the book has essays which talk about these traditions. But interestingly, the centrality is given to Ravana in Kathakali, which offers an alternative political vision, whereas in the Yakshagana, there is an attempt to denude religiosity from the play, and which is actually a contrast from the expression of religious devotionalism offered in the Ram Leela performances in North India. And I agree with you, Professor Shiva Prakash, when you say that religiosity is not the only essence of Ramayana. We have to look beyond religious traditions and beyond religiosity. The book makes us aware that there were multi-directional traffic between South India and Southeast Asia, which acted as interconnected nodes, contributing to the genesis and circulation of the Ramayana story, leading to the several centers of Ramayana discourse. And I would like to end this first section by stating that fact that reading this book was indeed a rewarding experience. I learned a lot. I'm not a Ramayana scholar per se. My only claim to be here perhaps is that I work on the linkages, I work on connected histories. So the way the book has brought in the connected history of the regions, both within South India and beyond that, is fascinating. In this short span of time, it was not possible to discuss individual essays, and I seek indulgence from the authors, the editor, the contributor, and the publishers, and of course the Achyuta Rao Foundation deserve a big round of applause, and we look forward to many such crossings in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suchandra. So now I come to you, Parul. In the book, you mentioned about Ramayana being rooted in the elements that are intrinsic, to its narrative of being a Mahakavya, and something about extrinsic about it, the context, the social, the political, cultural, and religious context. So, if you could speak a little bit about this character of Ramayana and maybe a little more, respond to them. 5 to 7 minutes.
Thank you, Neeta. Thank you, Professor Shiva Prakash. It's an honor to share the platform with you. Thank you for your views on the book, and thank you, Suchandra, for such an erudite review of the book. So I'm missing all the wonderful contributors. Only Sharada Srinivasan is present in the front row. I'm delighted to see her. Several of them are on the live stream, and I kind of blindly say hello to them. I'm missing you. To come back to Neeta's question, intrinsic and extrinsic is something that I've used in the last section of my introduction, having all these wonderful contributions, some of them by contributors who've spent a lifetime on the Ramayana scholarship. Now, what I was trying to do, what Professor Shiva Prakash was saying was, about the dots all around and trying to connect the dots. And in trying to connect the dots, I was trying to understand the processes that actually constantly caused the flow of the epic. So whose epic? It's everybody's epic, they say Sakala Hansama Ramu Biraje. And so intrinsic is the intrinsic structure of the epic. And what I mean is we're looking at the language of that prose and poetry, language of the Mahakavya, which I'm sort of very quick to qualify that the intrinsic and the extrinsic are interlinked. But by that, I mean the structure of the Mahakavya, that it can be, assimilated in parts. So just one episode can then be taken like it happens in Vayankulit Kelantan, in Professor Ghulam Sarwar Yusuf's paper, where a part of it is then assimilated by the performers and mixed with the story of Banasura and Mohini. And then Vishnu dances and annihilates Nonduk, who is an earlier incarnation of Ravana. So, what I'm trying to say is this episodic assimilation, and then in some other cases, entirety of the Ramayana. So the Bhatti Kavya goes to central Java, and a large portion of the Bhatti Kavya is retained. But then Malini Saran's paper talks about the discourse on ethics that takes predominance in the central Javanese, old Javanese Kakavin. So that is what I mean by the interplay of the intrinsic and the extrinsic.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for that. We come back to Professor Shiv Prakash. Professor Nandi, in one of his essays, says every society loves its classics, but they do not live by them. They live by the vernacular or the popular incarnations. So if you could speak a little more about popular incarnations that probably exist within Karnataka or a little beyond that.
First of all, I don't want to take seriously this divide between the classical and the vernacular. It's this kind of theorization comes from a kind of prejudiced mind which doesn't have access to all the facts. There's always been a continuity between the classical and the non-classical Magda and Desi throughout history. And this is best seen in this book. And also this concept of classic is come from Western thinking. It was not there in our languages. In the West also people have, tried to understand what is meant by classics. T.S. Eliot said classic is the language of the imperial culture. So there has to be the maturity of language, the maturity of manners for a classic to emerge. So in the whole of European history, he considers Virgil's Roma as the only classic. But later, another British critic, Frank Kermode, questioned this and he said, a classic is something that is patient with time. It survives many, tricks that time plays on it. Shakespeare is a scholar. Of course, T.S. Eliot wouldn't have Shakespeare as a classic. It's not a classic itself. It's too immature. Shakespearean imagination is too immature, too savage to be counted among classics itself. So Ramayana is that great work which has great patience. It has survived so many changes. And one of the things he asked me, what is I like most about this book? I see all these chapters in this book, they make sense together. I can't tell one from the other. This is my experience of reading it. And what is very interesting is it problematizes many of our preconceived notions about tradition and our relationship with tradition. And most people, some people in a very crude way, some people in a sophisticated way, they think tradition has something to be preserved. Otherwise, it will die. And there is some origin in the past. Some people, for example, believe that Valmiki Ramayana is the original Ramayana. But the great Gujarati scholar who has edited Bhagwan Das, who has edited this Bili Ramayana, says Bili Ramayana is much older than classical Ramayana because it represents the matriarchic phase of history. Now, where is the origin of the Ramayana? If I venture a tentative answer to this question, it's not in the past, it's in the future. Everybody is trying to correct the story of the Ramayana. You know the Yakshaganas, when Sita wants to follow Rama into Vanavas, Rama says, no, don't follow me because it's very difficult in the forest and you are a princess, you've been a princess, enjoyed palace comforts, etc. And he tries to convince her very hard, but she doesn't agree. And Rama is very logical. But Sita says, defeats all his logic by saying one thing. Tell me one Ramayana where Sita didn't follow Rama to the forest. So I need to come with you. So because this has happened in the other Ramayana, this should happen here also. But if you look at the genealogy of the Ramayanas, it's more closer to the concept of genealogy than history. Here, sometimes there's repetition. There's also complete violation of the earlier expression. For example, I listened to one Ramayana rendering by an illiterate woman in Gubi Taluk, in a small village. And this is the last, this Rama and Sita, after Rama defeats Ravana, they come back in many Ramayanas, you have this Agni Pariksha, fire ordeal. In this rendering, Sita doesn't go through this fire ordeal. Instead, Rama says, look at that barren tree. If you are a Pativrata, you touch this, and it should bear so many fruits that all the hungry birds from all over the world should come and eat it. They should feel safe, sacred. Then she touches it. This is a very primitive ritual in India. It's called Dohara. It's there in Kalidasa's, Malavikagnimitra. Yes, that's with the feet. This she does. And This story, this which deviates from Valmiki Ramayana and other Ramayanas. There are so many in Karnataka. Kumar Vyasa, 15th century poet who wrote this Mahabharata, he tells us why he didn't write the Ramayana story. He says, There are so many Ramayanas all over. I can't put my foot anywhere. So I prefer to write another Mahabharata. There are so many, but most of them are gone. And most of them have disappeared. So this individual woman, I don't even remember her name, she gave this wonderful Ramayana. So tradition is not something given. Tradition is something, as Boris, this great Russian writer, said, we are recreating every moment. And tradition is not in the past. Octavio Paz, when he talks about the tradition of America, the tradition in the poetry of Walt Whitman, says, where is the tradition? It's not in the past, in the future. But where is that future? That is the future which is eternally deferred. So tradition is here and now, we're recreating. And this is the greatest lesson of the different reincarnations of the Ramayana. And one of the, dhvanis of this book. It's not overtly stated. It's what Sanskrit poeticians call dhvani. And Abhinav Gupta said, it's not just poetry which has dhvani, even Shastras have dhvani. So here is Shastra, which has dhvani like Kavya.
Fascinating listening to you. And very, very aptly put. Classic is something that's patient with time. I think that's a takeaway just now, what you said, and wonderfully said. We need another 40 minutes, Mr. Prasanna, he says. Yeah. So thank you very much. So Suchandra, very quickly, you said about social distance but social nearness. So what about, was it only a part of the cultural imagination, or how much of it was part of the political imagination at that time? Because earlier, Ambassador Rao also spoke about, very quickly she makes a comment about cultural diplomacy. So is there any historical evidence to that? Very quickly, and then we'll take one or two questions from the audience.
Yeah, very quickly. Yes, of course, this Ramayana, Mahabharata and Jataka stories, these are now being taken as soft power to understand the nearness of between the two regions. So convergence, as I mentioned, was one of the very important things. Now, let me tell you just with one example, like Ramayana, Jatakas were also very famous. So when I was talking about these episodes, that's how some episodes are like taken for some and important in some areas and how it is represented. Quickly, I will take you not to Ramayana, but to a Jataka story. And this is the Jataka story is about Mahajanaka Jataka. And the basic of the story is that Mahajanaka was a prince, and then he was banished from his kingdom by his uncle. And then he tells his mother that I want to earn a lot of money, so that I want to go to Suvarna Bhumi. Suvarna Bhumi was the El Dorado. So I want to go there, get riches and come back. So he went, and there was he braved the ocean naturally, crossed the seas, and there was a very storm and other things. So the ship was sinking, and he was quite intelligent, so he knew how to do it. So he jumped into the sea and went quite far. And then there is this is the Buddhist tradition, there is Manimekhala, goddess Manimekhala as the protector from the sea, just as we have Tara as the protector of this from the sea. So Manimekhala sees him, rescues him, brings him to Videha. This is in Mithila, in Bihar, present-day Bihar, brings him there, and then he's restored to the kingdom, and then he rules for a long time. Then he becomes an ascetic and he embraces Buddhism. So that is the whole story which we have in the Jatakas. Now, when this story is represented, and much later, in time and space, it is much later, but we find that it is wonderfully represented in various stupas in Cambodia, in Thailand, and even in the paper folios in British Library we have. Then, but what part of the story is represented? It is the story where Manimekhala saves Mahajanaka when he is ought to go to Suvarna Bhumi. So when we look at Ajanta, we have this story of Mahajanaka. But in Ajanta, it is the story when he becomes the king, rules nicely, and then embraces asceticism. So here is the clue that for the Southeast Asian people, their worldview, in their worldview, they wanted this story because it was related to Suvarna Bhumi, their country. And so they actually translated these stories. And even in the 16th century, 17th century, you have these representations. So therefore, when these stories are evoked, these are kind of a soft power. So, when we traveled, both me and Parul, we have extensively traveled in regions of Southeast Asia. And I remember in Myanmar, they are looking at one single brick and say, this is Mauryan time. We say, no, it is not during, but they won't listen to us. So because they are so much into this cultural convergence, the nearness. So it is the social nearness. They feel that we had the past was there. We were very close. And this brings in the question of, I'll stop with that, the Bay of Bengal community. So this is the Bay of Bengal community we don't have now, but at that point of time, there were certain things which actually formed the Bay of Bengal community.
Thank you very much. I think it's just heating up and I wish we could just take it forward. Maybe one question from the audiences, if there's any.
Thank you for the book. Actually, I wanted to know about the Southeast regions in South India, a story about the Ramayana as well. But during the talk, I found one more interesting thing about the origin of Ramayana. In manuscript is around, you said before Valmiki as well, there is someone from Gujarat who written about it. Can I know about that one?
He's a famous folklorist from Gujarat, a tribal lore expert, and he edited the Bili Ramayana and Bili Mahabharata in Gujarati. It's published in Gujarati, not yet been translated into Hindi or English. I have seen the performance of this Ramayana in Bili village in near Khet Brahma in Gujarat. And he has spoken on this in several seminars.
So last word from you, Parul. Last 1 minute about if you would like to say something, and we come to if you would like to respond to something.
No, I think that three seems to have been a good number for this book. I was just thinking about it when I was listening to everyone, and also to see the 3 sections, visual, literary, and performance cultures. And in the joining of the dots and in the connections also, there is not just the connection across space, and not just the connection vertically, from the ancient to the contemporary, as a continuous flow seems to be the thing. But the number 3 is the Margi and the Deshi that we were talking about, that there is this continuous dialogue between the folk and let us say the more elitely patronized with and therefore they develop a more sophisticated grammar of expression. So this kind of a vertical integration also, and in what is called the vernacular now, the vernacular in the South Indian traditions and the vernacular in the Southeast Asian traditions actually comes so close that sometimes I feel that the oral traditions in the vernacular have had a much greater impact than we are willing to accord credence to. So that's about all, and much gratitude to everybody who has been involved with this book and to this wonderful audience here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Professor Shiv-Prakash, for being part of it. And thank you, Suchandra and Parul, for being a part of this. Thank you very much, audience, for being with us as long. We have something quickly to conclude. I think I invite Mr. Prasanna.
Just I would like to thank you for wonderfully moderating this session. Thank you very much.
Big applause for Neeta Inamdar, and A big applause for Professor D.S. Achyuta Rao's son, Mr. D.A. Prasanna.
So I request Professor Inamdar to hand over a collection of books to the panelists.
The bag is lovely too.
So now we have the next segment. Oh, to me. Thank you very much. So we move to the last segment, and I request the panelists to kindly take their seat, and I invite Madhu Natraj to come on the stage. So as you know, she's a famous choreographer, and the captivating performance will conclude this event, and I'm very confident that you'll enjoy it very much. Madhu.
Pranam to Dr. Achyuta Rao and Dr. Shettar. And, I said to Dr. Prasanna ji that inviting me in such an august gathering of scholars is like bringing sand to a beautiful beach. And so I will only kind of set the cadence and context for what we will be presenting to you, which was Ramanubhav, which was again commissioned by DSA Foundation, the Achyuta Rao Foundation, in 2017 as part of the Ramayana conference. And it is experiencing the Mahakavya through the lens of dance. No other text has captured our imagination as the Ramayana has. No other text has informed the content and form of our dance idioms in India as the Ramayana has. As we sit here sharing this space somewhere in the world, a Ramayana production is being conceived, a part is being run, being read, a kand is being recited, even on Clubhouse. And it is a living tradition. And I just like to say that I grew up in a family of artists, and my mother was a dancer, Guru Maya Rao, and she used to choreograph the Ramayana for the Natya Ballet Center, which was done in the Ramlila ground. So no other text has also provided a fecund ground for us to exercise our artistic license as we wish, and also for commercial enterprises to populate that space. I remember the Ramayana, Sita's dowry, and the Ramayana would be stopped, and all the shopkeepers of Old Delhi would come, and then her dowry would be electric stoves and washing machines. Ganeshji would come with his big mask and Bata shoes, which was the main sponsor that evening. And listening in green rooms and recording studios as Chaupais or the Ramayana Darshan was being recorded. And I remember Anil Bishwas, who was a patron, the famous music composer, telling us about one particular Punjabi Ramayana that he was privy to, where they couldn't find the ring to give Hanuman. So Lakshman quickly ran, came back, said, "Bhaiya, nahi mil raha." So Ram said, "Acha, koi baat nahi, tusi meri watch le jao. तुम मेरी घड़ी ले जाओ, so and or a Yakshagana performance where a very disgruntled Sugriv is complaining about Vali and calls out the corrupt municipal corporator of the region. So I'd just like to tell you that we looked at the works of Tulsidas, of Kamban, Arunachal Kavi, Valmiki, Kuvempu, and more, and it's a spatio-temporal exploration through the forms of the Jatra tradition, the Mandukya Shabdam of Kuchipudi, the Kathavachak tradition of Kathak, Bharatanatyam, Yakshagana, various martial arts like Thangtha, Chow, and others. And we are only showing you an 8-minute excerpt of a 100-minute production, which had about 20 dancers and 10 musicians performing live. And I'd like to just end with the thought, production ends with that too, which is, where is Rama's ring? Who is your Ram? Which is your Ramayana? Thank you. One of our favorite episodes as we jump now to the Kishkinda Kand. We follow the unity of space and time in Sanskrit theatre, where chronology doesn't really matter. The theatre of imagination. This is the Vali Moksha, the entry of Sugriv, and he sees these two strange mortals, very handsome, ravaged by living in the forest, walk in to Kishkinda. And their first reaction is they are completely mortified. But to fortify himself, he calls Hanuman, who is going to become a very important character in our story. And he offers to go and talk to these two men.
ಯಾರೋ ಉತ್ತರ ದೇಶದಿಂದ ಬಂದಿರಬೇಕು. ಬೇರೆ ದೇಶದಿಂದ ಇಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಆಗಮಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇವರ ಬಗೆಯನ್ನು ತಿಳಿಯುವುದು ಹೇಗೆ? ಇಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಅಲ್ಲಿಯವರೆಗೆ ಹೋಗಿ ಅವರು ಯಾರು, ಎಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಬಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಯಾಕಾಗಿ ಬಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಎಂಬುದನ್ನು ನೀನು ತಿಳಿದುಕೊಂಡು ಬರಬೇಕು. ಅಪ್ಪಣೆಯನ್ನು ಕೊಡು, ಹೋಗಿ ಬಾ.
We now move to Arunachala Kavi's 18th century composition, which is popularly seen in the Bharatanatyam style. Ni urai pai Hanuman. You shall say thus, O Hanuman. Hanuman tells her he is the Doot of Sri Ram. I need proof, she says. And Rama's ring. Will he really come? I will take you with me across Lanka. Come with me, Ma, he says. But Sita is adamant. I'm after all the queen of Ayodhya. Let him come here and claim me. Let him defeat Ravan. That is Dharma. Ram was now free to go meet his beloved Sita and take her back home. Was this going to be a happy ending? But as Valmiki says, when Ram does meet her, he humiliates her. Of course, Sita walks out unscathed by the fire, but humiliated beyond repair. Our own poet laureate Kuvempu had another version. In his retelling, Sita did not walk into the fire alone.
ನಾನಾಯ್ತು ದೀಪ್ಯಮಾನಂ ಚಲಿಸಿದ ರುಚಿತೆಗೆ ನೋಡ್ಪರ ವಿಸ್ಮಯಂ ಚಿಂತೆಗೆ ತಿರುಗುವಂತೆ ಓ ಎಂಬರಿತರೊಳೆ ತಾಂ ಪ್ರವೇಶಿಸುತ್ತುಜ್ವಲಿಪ ಗೋಪುರೋಪಮದಗ್ನಿ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಮರೆಯಾದನ್ಯೇ
As you know, the Uttarakhand is more full of devastation than happiness. Sita eventually surrenders to Mother Earth. Lakshman commits suicide, or was it murder? Ram knows it is his time to go to Vaikunt. But even Yama is scared to come to Ayodhya because of his loyal friend and Kavach, Hanuman. Rama one day takes off his ring and drops it, as if by mistake, into a crevice and says to Hanuman, Hanuman, can you go fetch my ring? Hanuman transforms himself to the size of a little fly and dives into the earth. He reaches the netherworld, Patal Lok, and encounters the king of serpents, Vasuki, who guards Patal Lok. Oh Lord Vasuki, can you help me find the ring of my Ram, Sri Ram? Vasuki laughs. He says, sure, let me take you to the ring room. Lo and behold, there is a heap of rings. Which is my Rama's ring? Which is my Rama's ring? He says. At that point, Vasuki says something very profound. He says, in every kalpa, in the second quarter of the Treta Yuga, a Hanuman comes down to the netherworld looking for the ring of Ram. By the time he goes back up, Ram is gone. This, my friend, is the cycle of life and death. Rama has to keep returning, for which he has to go. Hanuman looks for his ring. Which is Rama's ring? Which is my Rama's ring?
ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡಲು
Which is your ring? Which is your Rama? Which is your Rama? I wish we can have the full production sometime live over here. I'd like to thank Shri Prasanna ji, Rajni and Surbhi for inviting us and the DSA Foundation. And I would like to thank the project head of our company, Kirti, who took the humongous task of editing that version. Kirti is right here. And he was also Ram. And sitting with him is wonderful principal dancer of our company, who was Sita. And incidentally, they are married to each other. And unlike Ram and Sita, not separate. So there's Rupa. If you can pull down your mask for a second so they can see you. Thank you so much on behalf of Natya Institute of Kathak and Choreography and the STEM Dance Company. It's an honor and a delight to be here. And that book will be read by all of us, and takes a pride of place in our 1,700 other books in our library. And thank you.
Now, with this, we bring this wonderful evening to a close. And I thank all the speakers and all the participants and those who have come here for attending this program. Thank you.